This podcast is brought to you by Free Buddhist Audio, the Dharma for your life. Our work is funded entirely by donations from our generous listeners. If you would like to help us keep this free, make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. Thank you, and happy listening.
So this is the 5th out of 5 talks, and we've been talking about the 5 vital qualities of the mind, the 5 vital forces of the mind, also known as the 5 spiritual faculties. And, it's kind of befallen on me to give the last of these talks, which is on wisdom, or what Buddhists mean when they talk about wisdom. So I thought where I would start was I would start with one of the text messages that we got to do. So those of us on the urban retreat, recognisable, some of us, by these red threads which bind us all together, those of us that have signed up for the urban retreat have every day been getting a couple of text messages reminding us on retreat. One's a sort of instruction, like, the one yesterday was do something generous in the next 5 minutes. And the other's an aphorism, something to ponder on. So, who can remember what the first text message said today? They were pondered on deeply all day. It was something like, if you try and explain the unknown by means of the known, you'll never learn. Yes, so that's what it was. If you try and explain the unknown by means of the known, you'll never learn anything. You read that and you think, oh yeah, that's it's got a ring of truth about it, but also it's immediately throws us into quite a big problem, doesn't it? Because what else can we do except what we know? How else can we describe anything except in terms of what we already know? So that's the first problem with trying to talk about wisdom. That's the objective problem. There's a subjective problem as well, which is I don't really know what to say. And I was thinking about this. I've been teaching here at the Buddhist Centre for at least 20 years. I can't be sure, but I think if it was 20 years ago and I was giving this talk about wisdom, I'd have probably had quite a few things to say. I'd have probably kind of, oh yeah, I'll tell you this and I'll tell you that. It's an interesting phenomenon, isn't it, that the more deeply you go into anything worthwhile, I think, is a sort of paradox that actually you think you ought to be getting closer to what it is, but actually what you just realise the vastness of the thing. So if something like Buddhist wisdom, enlightenment, which are kind of synonymous, nirvana, here you are, you're practicing away. In my case, I've been teaching for 20 years, practicing for about 30 years. You'd sort of think one would be getting closer to something. And in a certain sense you are. But I think what you're getting closer to is realising just how vast and huge, how much you don't know. It's been exacerbated in my case by just going on a 5-month retreat, or 5 months worth of retreats, which seem to have had the effect of making me even less sure of what is meant by Buddhist wisdom, or more sure, not so much less sure of what is meant by Buddhist wisdom, but more sure that it's bigger and vaster than I ever thought it was. There's a quote I'm often quoting here, but I really like it. It's by a scientist called Haldane, and he said apparently the universe isn't only queerer than we suppose, it's queerer than we can suppose. So I think if you talk about Buddhist wisdom, it's not only vaster than we suppose, it's vaster than we can suppose, which kind of brings us a bit back to the text message of today, doesn't it? So there's both a sort of objective and a subjective reason of why this is hard to talk about. But you'll be glad to hear I'm going to try and give it a go with those caveats. The team are all on hand. I said, team, just stay around me in case. So Yeah, so Buddhist wisdom is the culmination of the path, if you want to use that term, the path. And I'm going to go back to where we started this series, which is what Buddhists mean when they talk about faith. So that was what I was attempting to talk on Monday night, because they sort of join up. Like faith's the beginning, if you like. Wisdom, I wouldn't say the end, because there is no end, but maybe the fruition or the culmination. And they're on a trajectory. So they're linked with each other. So I'm going to go back a little bit to what we mean when we talk about faith in Buddhism. And it's good to have a recap anyway, I think. So on Monday, what I described was what we call faith or Shraddha having three aspects. And these three are head, heart, and legs. So that's the easy way to remember them, head, heart, and legs. But let's start in the middle with heart. There's even a sort of prefiguration of faith, or what we mean in Buddhism when we talk about faith. And that's ordinary human responsiveness. I say ordinary, maybe it's better to say natural human responsiveness, because it's sort of extraordinary, actually, as a human capacity, that we have got the capacity to respond to value. And what I was saying on Monday, and I really think this is true, is that, in a way, that's what defines a human. That's what defines us as human, or one of the defining things about being human, is that we've got this capacity to respond to value. So we've got a sort of faculty that sort of recognises the truth when we hear it, for example. We've got a faculty that it's kind of, it's not a scientific thing. It's a faculty of almost measuring or intuiting things that can't be measured scientifically. Like a bit like when Singamanis was talking about the winter retreat and the power of 130 people meditating together. And those of us that have been on a retreat like that, or even been here, we sort of know what that feels like. But like, you can never measure it with a scientific instrument, could you? You can never. But at the same time, we know that it's true. We might even say this room even has got an atmosphere of meditation. I certainly feel that. That was one of the things I felt being away for quite a long time and coming back. So that's what I mean by this kind of natural human responsiveness to value, to goodness we might see in other people, to the truth when we hear it spoken, to beauty, aesthetic beauty, but kind of moral beauty as well. So that's a human faculty, and it's a faculty we can develop, we can cultivate. It's natural to us, but we've got a choice of whether we want to sort of educate it, draw it out more, or whether we stifle it. Sadly, sometimes it gets stifled in our lives and in our culture through cynicism or a kind of fear, really, fear of our own emotions, or fear of our own responses, or maybe even might be fear, but I know I kind of think, oh, don't be silly, It's the sort of, I was reading a novel the other day, and I was really, really engaging with the character of the novel, and then I was doing the Metta Bhavana, and suddenly this imaginary character was appearing in my Metta Bhavana, and I could notice myself saying, oh, don't be silly, don't be silly, that's just, so that kind of, and in a sense, why did I do that? It was a kind of squashing of my own natural responsiveness for no reason, really. So that's a natural quality. It's a prefiguration of faith. It's very, very important if we want to live any sort of meaningful life to recognise it, to cultivate it, not to squash it. When that natural faculty comes across the values expressed in Buddhism, so when it comes across the ideas like that growth and enlightenment is possible for all beings, represented by the Buddha, when it comes across the teachings of the Buddha, when it comes across the community, if that faculty responds to those, then it becomes sort of faith proper, Buddhist faith proper, yeah? So, but it starts with this responsiveness. It's not, faith in Buddhism isn't something we add on to ourselves, it's something that sort of emerges from this. So that's the sort of heart aspect of faith. And then the sort of intuitive, even intellectual aspect is what's our response to the teaching. So if we hear a classic Buddhist teaching such as hatred is never appeased by hatred, it's only appeased by love. If we hear that and we resonate with it, if that feels true to us, there can be a kind of yes in our being, oh yes, like, that's articulated what I've always known and felt. Or if we hear a classic teaching like, yeah, all conditioned things are impermanent, or the craving always somewhere brings about suffering, and if we feel a sort of intuitive yes to that, that's the intuitive. I kind of hesitate to use the word intellectual because I don't. It's not. It doesn't remain intellectual, but it does involve our intellect because it involves our thinking faculty. So there's that aspect. That's the sort of what I've glossed as the head aspect. And then what I've glossed as the legs aspect is just as when we act. So actual action is part of faith, and or not. It's quite interesting. How we act is very telling about what our view on life is and what our view of ourself is. I was talking to someone just last night. She was very much, I think she's here. It was, it was Jane I was talking to. We were talking about going on retreat. And I was thinking, if you're thinking of going on retreat and then you just do that simple action of booking up the retreat, that already has an effect on your psyche. Before you even get on the retreat, it's like you've said to yourself, I mean this, I'm serious about this. So that's the volitional aspect, and it affects you to take action, and also affects you not to take action as well. So that's the volitional aspect of faith. There's more that could be said about all these, but I'm going to. I just wanted to give you a little introduction or recap, and then talk about how these tie up with what Buddhists call wisdom. So let's start with this intuitive, even intellectual aspect of wisdom. So as I was saying, we can, when we hear the teachings of the Dharma, we can have a response of yes, or we can have a response of no as well. I'm not saying one has to have a response of yes, but if you have a response of yes, then you'll naturally want to explore that further. So the practice then is to more deliberately take the teachings and reflect on them, really, really test them. As one teacher recently said, test them to destruction. So even if you go back to those ones I mentioned, so it's a classic Buddhist teaching, hatred is never pacified by hatred. You might think, yeah, that's probably true, but really ask yourself, is it almost true? How do I know it's true? So really, we can really test them within ourselves. And we can do that in quite a meditative way as well. Singha Manas last night was talking about absorption. So if we find ourselves in an absorbed state of meditation, we can drop in a question like that. That'll help us to test it more deeply. And if we become convinced, then we can rest in that conviction. And wisdom proper is when we're resting in the conviction. So we take the teachings, we reflect on them deeply in a meditative way. And I think that, this sort of questioning aspect is quite important. It's not that we're trying to sort of hypnotize ourselves or lull ourselves into thinking certain things. We're really using our intelligence. And then if conviction arises, we can rest in that conviction. So that's one aspect of wisdom. And there's many teachings. The truth of the sort of assertion of Buddhist teachings that all conditioned things are impermanent. That's a classic one to reflect upon. So we can reflect on that. So that's one aspect. And you see how it joins up? So you've got this, you start off with the intuition, that kind of sounds kind of right. I feel drawn to this, but then you test it. And as you test it, it becomes more and more properly something that you could call wisdom. And then if we look at the this kind of heart aspect, this responsiveness, you can... So with this one, it's not so much you're testing it, it's you're just continually sort of trying to allow it to be drawn forth. So starting with ordinary human responsiveness, then you take the three jewels of Buddhism, the Buddha, the Dharma and the Sangha, the community, the spiritual community, the Sangha, the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha, the Buddha, the ideal of Buddhahood itself, this ideal that all beings can realise what we call Buddhahood, the state of being fully awake. And you just see if your heart responds to that. You just, and then you just continue in that. So you look for beauty, where you see beauty, where you see value, you allow the responsiveness. It's almost like you get out of your own way and allow that responsiveness until it becomes, it's like it becomes second nature. It's not something, you're no longer trying to do it. It just becomes natural to you to respond to truth, respond to beauty wherever that's found, and it becomes natural to you to find it, to see the truth, to see the beauty in whatever situation. So it becomes this more and more alive quality in you. And when it's completely second nature, when it's completely alive, then that is an aspect of Buddhist wisdom. That for an enlightened being, an enlightened being would be just sort of vibrating all the time with the truth and with the beauty. Everything would appear as illumined. Everything would appear sort of shining. I mean, things would still be things, but there'd have this quality about them, which again you might have experienced even if you've only recently started to meditate, or even if you've, especially if you've been on retreat, that things start to look just a little bit shinier. I noticed that when I came back off my long retreat, like people just looked more beautiful. People just looked more beautiful to me. Just as when you're in the opposite state of mind, when you're in a very kind of closed, kind of cynical state of mind, everybody looks kind of ugly, Do you know that's maybe it's more easy to know the opposite. So that's the trajectory, and then the trajectory of the volitional. As you respond to value, and especially as you respond to other people, then less and less you'll want to do actions that cause harm to other people. So this brings in the sort of what we call ethics in Buddhism. So you'll naturally want to cause less harm. And again, it'll happen naturally, but you can also educate it. You can also cultivate it. So your actions will become more and more, well, you want to be more and more helpful to others. You become less and less self-centered. Like usually sooner or later, everything comes back to sort of in our unenlightened state, everything comes back to, well, what's in it for me? As you practice, it's almost the sort of elastic of that will become more and more sort of stretched till it finally, gives way completely. So this volitional aspect that's started off at the beginning of our journey with Shraddha, our faith, becomes our ethical practice. We become, we work at becoming less and less selfish. First of all, because we see that it's actually makes us happier to be less selfish. Following from that, we see that, well, we don't want to harm other beings. For an enlightened being, again, this would just be second nature. It would no longer be a practice. For an enlightened being, harming other beings would be impossible. It wouldn't be a practice. In a certain sense, it wouldn't be a choice anymore. It would just be simply impossible to harm other living beings. There'd be so much empathy. It wouldn't be possible. Selfishness would be completely overcome. That's quite hard to imagine, really. Well, certainly I find that it's hard to imagine. The sort of the forces that sort of bind us to ourselves are very, very strong. Maybe again they're stronger than we realise. I noticed this on my solitary retreat. I was telling some of my friends, I was meditating quite a lot on solitary retreat, and I was doing these kind of reflections that I've been describing, trying to reflect on these things like the truth of impermanence, asking myself, is this really true? So I was doing that a great deal over the period of 5 months. And towards the end of the retreat, every night, it's funny being, I was on part of this retreat, I was on my own for 2 months. It's funny when you're on your own in a little cabin or whatever for several days or weeks or months on end. The days are usually fine, but kind of as night falls, it's a bit different. There's a sort of, it's a bit like little bits of fear would happen and little bits of unease of night falling. Strange, isn't it? And then there would be morning, and then you think, oh yeah, it's fine, everything's fine. But as towards the end of the retreat, as night would fall, I just started getting this little unease of, do you know what? I definitely don't want to die. And it just started to hit me that for all I've done the Metta Bhavana for years and think of myself as quite a nice person most of the time, I thought, do you know the person in the whole world who you least want to die? Yourself. I just thought, I don't care who dies, as long as it's not me. As long as it's not me. All the people at the bottom, like, if I'm really honest with... No, I don't mean that I don't care. No, I don't mean that I don't care. Well, I sort of do in a way. Yeah, it's sort of like, not that I actually don't care, but like something like, they can all go first, as long as it's not me. As long as... Strangely enough, I felt this, not that there was a sign of progress, but I thought it felt true. I felt like I've got to the truth, The gloss is gone, the gloss of Miss Nice, Buddhist practitioner, that gloss is gone. The person the person I least want to die is myself. So I thought there was a sort of sense of truth, and at least I'd got to that. So that force is very, very strong, that force of wanting to exist, you know. I mean, it was funny, actually, even going away for 6 months, it's quite interesting. If you go away for 6 months, a lot happens while you're gone, and you haven't had a say in it, you know. So so even because I work full time here at the Buddhist Centre, and very much enjoy that. But it was interesting going away for 6 months, and certain decisions had been made, and I thought, oh, like no one asked me, you know. Usually I like to have a say in everything. So, you know, that's just 6 months. What about when I'm dead, you know? All these things. How is life going to go on without me? So, you know, so the thought of not having a impact on the world anymore, it was like, yeah, very, very strong. So that will to exist is very, very strong. It's I think it's the strongest force there is. It was interesting, and yeah, I was going to say it was interesting, the talk last night. I'll just come back to that in a second. So that's the strongest force. So what the Buddha was doing was I think we used the term last night, turning around in the deepest seat of consciousness. So when you turn around in the deepest seat of consciousness, you're trying to take that will to exist and transform that into the will to enlightenment for the sake of all beings. You're not trying to turn it into the will to not exist. That would kind of just be the same thing the other way around. You're trying to transform it into the will to realize enlightenment for the sake of all beings. That is a massive thing we're trying to do, and I must say, and maybe that's kind of what I mean by saying realizing. When I was on this retreat, realizing the enormity of the task, you know, realizing the depth of that force, and thinking it's a primal force. It's what's in a way, it's been very useful to us. It's very useful, the wish to exist, you know. If we hadn't had it, we'd never have evolved as a species to be here. But then how we're going to, you know, to actually transform that into something that's not about me and my existence. It's about the well-being, the utter well-being of all beings, not just a little bit well-being, but the utter liberation of all beings. So that's what we're trying to do. Okay, so we've got these three things, right? We've got these aspects of faith, the head, heart, and legs, where each of these kind of corresponds to an aspect of wisdom. I suppose the head, heart, and legs of wisdom, sort of in its fullness. And so in the intuitive, intelligent aspect would be realizing, not just, actually it's far more than intellectual, of course, so it's not just intellectually assenting to all things that are impermanent. It's actually knowing that if you really knew it, you'd never be shocked again at any loss ever, because you'd be in harmony with that truth, yeah? So that's what I mean by testing it to destruction and then sort of... and then living it, actually. And then the heart, it would be a responsiveness that's just, you're just quivering with the truth and beauty and everything. And then the volitional would be you actually couldn't harm anyone. Your empathy would be such that you couldn't harm anyone. It would be impossible to sort of knowingly harm another being. So that's these. We start off with, they start off as ordinary human qualities. That's what's quite exciting. None of these are added on to us. Well, it's not just quite exciting. To me, it's like, utterly thrilling, actually, that these start off as human qualities. This is why Buddhism isn't how we normally think of as religion. Normally, I was brought up to think of religion as something you added on to yourself. even if one wasn't brought up religious, I think we can sort of subtly inherit that. But these are natural aspects of being human, and we can develop them. Now, it's not automatic, that development. We can't just kind of, we can't just sit back and wait for it to happen. All these three aspects have to be educated, drawn out. That's going to take, that's, I was going to say the work of a lifetime. It might be even more than that. It probably is even more than that. But then they can be, they can come to fruition, each of these three aspects. So what I want to, I've got two more things I want to say. One is I want to really emphasise that the three aspects are all important, that we can't just work on one without the other. We'll probably have a strength in one more than the other. And that's good, we can lead with that, but then we have to have the other two as well. And I want to talk about that in terms of an image and also a bit more conceptually. So the image that came to me as I was meditating this morning, partly due to a conversation I had yesterday, and partly due to a little adventure I had in Scotland recently, was of a hot air balloon. So the image of a hot air balloon. My little adventure in Scotland was with one of my little nephews. He's only 6. And we took him to the National Museum of Scotland. They've got a great sort of science bit where kids can play with stuff and so on. And one of the things you could play with was a hot air balloon. So you've got this thing, it's to kind of, just looks like a floppy bit of silk or nylon or something. But then you could press a button, fills with hot air. Of course, it rises up, goes right up. But, they built it very cleverly, so it goes up all the different floors of the very tall museum and gets to the ceiling, and then after a while it falls back down again. My nephew found this fascinating. Like for hours, my sister and I were sort of sitting on a bench while he had go after go after go pressing this button. He absolutely loved it. And in a way you can see why. It's quite sort of beautiful in a way, this. I think especially something that just looks all flabby and lying down, like filling up and filling up and going up to the ceiling. He absolutely loved it. And so I've sort of elaborated on the image of the hot air balloon to try and encompass these three aspects. I don't really know much about how hot air balloons work, but I imagine there's 3 things that you need. So you need the actual kind of, round bit, whatever you call it, and that needs to be filled with hot air. And then, while it's on the ground, it's tethered to the ground, isn't it? This one in Edinburgh was. So you've got these guy ropes that are holding it to the ground. And then I think there's something to do with sandbags, isn't there? You throw them out and it rises further. So you need to be operating, for the balloon to rise, you need to be operating all of these 3 aspects at once. So I was thinking the hot air is like the heart aspect. So that's like that corresponds to our responsiveness to beauty, our devotion even to the Buddha. So that's like the hot air that's making the balloon rise. But if if you haven't cut the guy ropes, that's going to take much more effort. It might even be impossible, or else it's going to take much more effort. So cutting the guy ropes is when you reflect on these Buddhist truths, when you actually see through the delusion. So, so Buddhism saying everything, all conditioned things are impermanent. Everything sort of, all appearances, nothing from the world of appearances can give us satisfaction. And there's nothing substantial, there's nothing fixed and unchanging. Actually, that was the second quote, wasn't it, today on your text message? But we think the opposite. Even if we intellectually assent to those things, unless we've consciously cut the ties or at least weakened them, we act as if things are permanent. We act as if we're permanent, we're going to live forever or be in a situation forever. We act as if things, even though we sort of know intellectually things can't bring us happiness, we accumulate them. We act as if they can, even though we might assent to that there's nothing fixed and unchanging. We act as if we're the separate self as opposed to you, these other separate selves. That causes suffering and so on. Unless we actively, weaken and then cut those guy ropes, our balloon isn't going to take off. And then there's our sandbag, so I thought that corresponds to the ethics. Unless we, lighten ourselves actually by skillful action, again we'll remain tethered we'll remain tethered. So we need to do all three. We need to be working in all these three areas for our hot air balloon to take off. So sort of more conceptually, so that's it in an image. More conceptually, you might think of each of these three aspects being like a corrective to the other. So if we only develop our heart response, for example, well, this can actually even be dangerous, It can be the stuff of fanatical delusion. If we don't temper our heart response by an intelligent consideration of the teachings, we can have a lot of conviction that God or the Buddha told us to do certain actions, for example, but we can be led in all sorts of directions. We need to keep our intelligence on board. If we only look at the ethical aspect of life, well, we can become a very good person. But it can be a kind of, this might sound a bit of a paradox, but it can be a sort of selfish goodness, do you know what I mean? It can be, oh, look at me, I'm so good, I'm so nice. I certainly have, I'm certainly not free of that myself. Yeah, if we hadn't had the reflection and the devotional aspect, if we just confine things to reflection, we can think we've got wisdom when we've only got intellectual understanding. Yeah, so there's the image of the balloon trying to sort of show us that we need all three, which I was quite pleased with that little image myself. But also there's the conception that you can see that each of the other two will correct the third. Yeah, if we just have one without the other two, we'll be led askew in some way. I'm sure there's more to say about each of those, but you can have a little think about that. Now, the last thing I want to say is that actually, much as I'm pleased with my hot air balloon metaphor, it actually isn't really good enough. It breaks down. All metaphors, I think, break down in the end, because the hot air balloon, if I'm thinking, if we're thinking of ourselves as this hot air balloon, even if we imagine it, there it is, it's free floating up in the sky, it's still limited because it's still got this kind of skin thing. It's still a thing floating in the sky, and it's still got too much of me in it. It's still got too much of, here's me trying to get this thing I'm calling wisdom or enlightenment or something. So for the image to really work as an image, somehow the balloon would have to stop being a balloon and just be a ball of light or something like that. And it would have to it'd be a ball of light, but actually there'd be loads of balls of light, and they'd all be shining and kind of interpenetrating their light with each other. for a start. So it wouldn't be there wouldn't be these kind of separate balloons, sort of me-shaped balloons, however lofty and free. The balloon is limited by its skin, so it'd have to be like a ball of light. So that gets a bit nearer it if we think of light, balls or beams of light interpenetrating. But even that's not enough, because there's still too much. It's still too much, like only from our own end. So now this is the bit that's a bit difficult to say, and this is me definitely speaking in sort of as it were mode. So what we've got to realise in the end, that as we're moving toward wisdom, towards enlightenment, as it were, it's moving towards us. That I don't know how to say this. It's like enlightenment itself wants us to become enlightened. Now, you've got to be very careful with language here, because you can't literally say that, but that is how we'll experience it. And I'm going to sort of bring us back down a bit to something we might have experienced to sort of illustrate it. So do you know the experience, like, if you've ever tried to like write a poem or paint a picture or have a tricky conversation, that sometimes it feels like you're making the effort from your end, but all of a sudden something just clicks, and it's like the poem wants you to write it, or the painting wants you to paint it, or the right words come into your mouth and you don't quite know how it happened. Like something, you become more like a vehicle for something that's experienced as bigger than you, that feels, you experience it as if it's drawing you on. Do people sort of know what I mean? Oh, good. Some people know it. I'm sure actually we've all had that to some extent. I think these sort of artistic analogies can be quite good, but also, communication and so on, and I'm sure there's other ones. So it's like that. It's sort of mysterious, but it's not out with our experience. And what Buddhism would say is, it's like, be open to that. At the same time, don't be too quick to think you know what's happening. That's why I'm being very careful to say as it were, and it feels like it's something, because by this stage, when you've gone from your balloon to your ball of light, by this stage anyway, what the whole notion of what's kind of emerging from within me, and what's not me, has broken down anyway. So that's starting to break down. And again, we'll have that's the experience in those artistic moments, that there's a sort of you can't tell what's you and not you. It's definitely, you are an important ingredient because something's coming through you, but you can't really say anymore, was that me or was that something else, not me? So that's what I want to end on, because that's important. That's the most important thing, really. That somehow we've got to find a way of realizing, just as we're making an effort towards enlightenment, that as it were, we've been drawn on. And this is why we have images of the Buddha. So we've got the Buddha figure here, which is kind of, you could say, the historical Buddha, although it's not really, because he wasn't like that size or gold, but, it is more or less. Although you would probably have experienced him as that if you've been at the time of the Buddha. You probably, as you walked into the clearing in the forest, say you were a monk or a nun at the time of the Buddha, you would have been drawn, the figure would have been very compelling. your eye, I'm sure your whole being would have been drawn to the Buddha more than anyone else, even if there was 1,000 or, more than 1,000 monks and nuns there, you would have, in an imaginative way, you would experience the historical Buddha as big and gold, as it were. And then every evening this week we've had archetypal Buddha on the shrine as well. The Buddha on the shrine tonight is the Buddha Vairochana, whose name means the illuminator. So this is just one of the archetypal Buddhas representing this quality of this quivering aliveness, sensitivity and responsiveness to truth and beauty. And the Buddha figures, they're representing that for us. So when I'm talking about just as we're being drawn to enlightenment, it's as if this principle of enlightenment is pulling us on, is drawing us on. It's as if we're back to our balloon analogy, it's as if, there's some distant star or planet that starts to be the gravitational field kind of influencing it in its flight. And that's what these archetypal Buddhas represent. That's why we have them on our shrines. That's why we bow to them. And as you practice, one starts to experience the relationship between oneself and the Buddha as not just one way. So and this is actually the point where we move from being, you could say, a devotee to a disciple. So as a devotee, we might bow to the shrine, either literally or just in that movement towards awakening, towards enlightenment, towards greater wisdom and compassion. We move towards that, but then we start to feel that the Buddha is moving towards us. And we can actually experience that in meditation if we imagine the Buddha. And I just encourage you to be open to that, not to be too sort of cynical about it. It's almost like, when I was on my retreat, I was imagining the Buddha, and I felt like, oh, he's pleased to see me. The Buddha's pleased to see me. Now, what does that mean? I can't say, I can't say what I mean by that, the Buddha's pleased to see me. It's not that I think there's an actual, Buddha in the sky kind of watching over me, looking at it literally, but in a way, why not imagine that? Even to say I'm imagining it brings it a bit too much the other way back to me. Just allow oneself to have a relationship with the Buddha, and allow that to be an actual relationship, which is two-way. But don't. So neither dismiss. My advice to you is neither dismiss that or sort of pin it down too soon. Just explore what it means, and in those ways we'll be moving towards what wisdom in Buddhism really means. So, on that perhaps slightly mysterious note, I leave us, I think, for this evening. So, we've explored the 5 vital qualities of the mind to some extent. Faith, and then energy, and then mindfulness, absorption, and now wisdom. All natural characteristics of the mind, all things that can be educated, drawn out, and all things that can will come to complete fruition. Well, in a way, when I say fruition, they're never ending. Even for a Buddha, they never come to an end. Even a Buddha will be, finding more and more expressions of those qualities. But a Buddha will never fall back from the completeness of those qualities.
We hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. Please help us keep this free. Make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. And thank you